Afternoon, everybody. My name is John Cruddas. I'm MP for Dagenham and Rainham in East London. Visiting fellow here at Nuffield. Tom Watson, obviously Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. We're here as part of the Future of the Left seminar series, which hopefully offers a place for thoughtful consideration of some of the challenges facing the left, some of our recent history, and the wider sort of political context. And rather than just focus on the future of the left for a minute, Tom, maybe we could just start with the last week or so, because, I don't know, you've been around the sort of national political conversation for nearly 30 years, but, and we've known each other for a long time, but I don't think I've witnessed a more turbulent, strange, bewildering period for many years. Maybe you want to, what does it look like from where you're sitting?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, from where I'm sitting, I'm usually feeling the excitement of Jeremy with the hairs on the back of his neck going on and thinking this government is going to collapse at any minute and there could be a general election. And I mean, it is thoroughly depressing, isn't it? I mean, to go to an international summit, to brief that you have a deal, and then to withdraw your own deal because you've not cleared your lines. I mean, it's. I've never known anything like it. And we are the laughingstock of Europe. We have a Prime Minister who is incapable of stamping authority on the most important talks facing our country in all our lifetimes. And it's very hard to see how you find a way through it. So it is depressing, and the effect of it is, you know, we either go through this mire for another 18 months with our authority in the world diminishing, with our soft power being reduced. We've lost a position on the European Court of Justice today. We're no longer in European City of Culture, which I think is appalling. All those little things that show the power of our state have been diminished, and there's no way through it. So it seems to me this government could collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. We could just end up with a crazy, chaotic event that sinks them. We have a sort of slightly chaotic general election. And there'll be a proper debate about Brexit in that general election, rather than a sort of proxy debate. And that would give the country a sort of opportunity to reset the dial on Europe. Now, I don't know what that would look like, and that's only one option, one potential outcome of the chaos. But I think we're getting nearer the point where Theresa May, all her options are closing down.
Well, there's a lot in that. I mean, I must admit, it's Thursday today. Monday, I was thinking, either this was some sort of ritual to allow the DUP to show its strength as bargainers, and this would play out through the rest of the week and they would land it by the weekend. But that doesn't quite look like the way it's shaking down. This is more stumbling through something without knowing where they're going.
Ian Paisley Jr. called me after it all collapsed. And I said, well, why did you do that for? He said, well, the first we knew about it was when we saw the briefing, the leaked briefing. We'd been asking for 2 weeks. I mean, there's no excuse for that. I mean, that's just utterly incompetent. I mean, it's beyond incompetent. I mean, it's national self-harm. And when you think that that's precisely what they did with the DUP when they announced after the election that they're forming a coalition with the DUP, and that's the first the DUP.
Well, they didn't know much about that at the time,
They didn't know much about that. So, I mean, you know, the golden rule of politics is you make mistakes a lot of the time, but just don't make the same mistakes. And it's caused unbelievable damage, and it's hard to think how you would work your way through it.
I suppose this morning we were looking at news stories and indeed a fair bit of commentary about Davis prepared to step up as some sort of transitional figure before a generational change before the next election within the Tory party, which sort of suggests that everyone's on manoeuvres. And there was a sense of that all through Westminster, wasn't there? That it was. Yeah. This was traumatic, but different elements within the Conservative Party were gaming it out literally day by day to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think their current strategic plan is to get to 2019 and change leader for a general election when the deal is done. But I think they're just reaching the point where they realise they can't get there with Theresa May. So there may be a transitional leadership. I mean, they may just go for the younger generation. But whatever they do, I think it would require a general election, because even a new leader, if they're to change or refocus their Brexit negotiation strategy or plan, I think they would need the authority of the country to do it. And it would actually strengthen a new leader's hand in those talks. So, now, look, I mean, they might want to, obviously, they're electoral organisers, and we've been on that side of the fence as well, John. I mean, all their organisers and pollsters will be saying, don't do it. But if I was a Tory leader, I would think it's in the interest of the country to reset the dial, and I'd probably want to roll the dice and take a risk.
It sort of throws the question up. Labour, I assume, was thinking that May would be there for the duration of the negotiations around Brexit.
Yeah.
Arguably, I mean, suggests that the Labour Party will move on to election alert again pretty quickly. Not necessarily the best time for an election, given the assumptions we were making around, well, I assume we were making around Brexit playing out before an election, which does alter our own internal calculations somewhat.
It does. This is probably the bit where I show an equal lack of clarity as the Tories are, but because it's coming at us thick and fast. I mean, operationally, work is underway to sort of prepare for the lowest cost general election campaign Labour has never ever fought. We're selecting candidates in offensive marginal seats now. If we go to a full term, I feel sorry for those candidates who will be knocking doors for 4.5 years, but we've got to be ready for that. And then when we go to, I mean, obviously the manifesto process will be, if there's an early election, we'll have to build on the manifesto from 6 months ago. But we will have to give greater clarity on our Brexit offer. I don't know what that's going to be yet, but I think we will obviously have to address the concerns of the current negotiations. Because right now, I mean, you know, we've got 72 hours of debate on Brexit on the floor of the House. We take them in 8-hour sessions. We vote every 4 hours. This week, I think we had one debate that finished at 1:30 in the morning. We had one that finished at 9:30, one that finished at 10:30. We were moving amendments that we think improved the position, and we lost every single vote. 72 hours of trying to improve the conditions for workers post-Brexit is essentially what we're trying to do, and we're losing every vote. So, I mean, we will have to come back with an alternative plan.
Well, it's quite interesting because Tony Blair this morning, for example, was saying that there's a void in the heart of Labour thinking around Brexit. I think that was the line he used. Which, now, you might say, he would say that, wouldn't he, given his sort of departure point in a lot of these conversations. But presumably there's a fair bit of work moving pretty quickly now, given...
Yeah, I mean, there's not a void, is there? There is a cacophony of voices, which is, you know, when you're trying to build a coalition on something as complex as Brexit, it's very difficult. Now, I think Keir Starmer is actually playing a very important role in bringing people's concerns together around a common set of principles by which that would underpin our negotiation position. Now, the difficulty is, again, when you're in opposition, when you've seen this debate about the sort of impact assessments being kept secret, it's very hard to make those sort of technical decisions that are required in a complex negotiation if you haven't got the information in front of you. So, I think he's doing well, and I think I think our position is right now. We keep all options open depending on where the negotiations go. And that includes the potential for a second referendum if the talks fail in the way that that some people suggest. But right now, I think our position is right to say we want to make sure that Brexit ensures we get tariff-free trade, that workers are protected, that our environmental protections remain, and that we're in a common framework of human rights that have served us well for many, many decades. And, you know, you've got to go in with an honest endeavour. Now, where we go on in the manifesto is down to the whole party. You know, we're a much more democratic party these days. There is a demand that we have an explicit commitment to a referendum on the outcome. I don't know whether we'll get to that point, but that will be a discussion if there is a second general election.
There was a TV programme just a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if anyone saw it, which tracked a number of Labour MPs through the course of the last election. And there was some fantastic footage of a series of MPs peering at TV screens at 10:01 when the exit poll came out. Yeah. And they were just transfixed, trying to hide or unfortunately revealed their true feelings at that moment in time. And it was great footage. What were you doing at 10:01 on election night?
I was on the phone to Jeremy.
So you had the result then? No.
When the exit poll came out, I phoned him, and we in fact, it was quite a funny day because my son had been given the day off to come and campaign with me. He's 12 years old, Malachy, and at about sort of 6:30, I always call him my speechwriter, right? Because when you've got kids and you're writing speeches, it's like they're always running around and you're trying to keep them occupied and you're writing your notes. So I write, you know, a few points, and I thought my speech at the count would be: this is a bad night for Labour. There are lessons to learn, you know, ba-dum. I didn't think it'd be as bad as people were predicting, by the way, but I didn't think we'd make the advances we did. And he said, well, you'll have to rewrite that, Dad. He said, everyone in my school is a Labour supporter. They love Jeremy Corbyn. So later on, when the exit poll came out, you know, we did it. I said, well, why don't you phone Jeremy and congratulate him? So, and I spoke to Jeremy, and for the first time in his life, he was utterly speechless. He could barely speak. He didn't know what to say. So Malachy went on and they had a little chat about Arsenal, and then they dragged him up to the count. But I mean, you know, I knew at 10:01 that politics had changed again forever, and we were in a totally different political context, and things needed to shift pretty quickly.
But you did detect, and I know this actually because I remember talking to you just before the day before, yeah. I think, that things were shifting in a very imprecise way. You didn't know where they was all going to land, but that something was churning underneath.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd got a program to visit 80 odd seats. I was focusing on defensive marginal, so I'd got a little sort of tour. In the end, I only did 50 plus because we had the terrorist attacks. But I spoke to a lot of people in a lot of towns, and you could feel them warming to Jeremy throughout the campaign. You know, he kind of found his inner voice in the campaign. They thought he came over as very genuine and authentic, and there was no, you know, the terms of the election had been set as sort of head to head, who will lead Britain, and you had Theresa May hiding. So, and he wasn't scared. I mean, you know, he did go out there, and I think people respected him for that. So, I could feel it coming back to us about 2 weeks before. But you know what it's like? The kind of media narrative is always behind what's actually going on in the country, and so you kind of, the headlines were raging, but you know, on the ground people were warned through TV and through sort of various communications, so their views were changing, and they weren't frightened of us. So I felt, you know, I thought we would come back around with what we had, and we'd win a few and lose a few. In the end, we did a lot better.
And the trigger points within this, I mean, it's usually focused on... Andrew Fisher did a session here a few weeks ago, a very thoughtful conversation around the manifesto. And that was one trigger point. And obviously the Conservative manifesto launch was itself another. Well, how do you see the sort of sequence of events leading?
Well, I think our manifesto. I mean, that is undoubtedly the worst 2 minutes of my life. When Andrew rang me, I was on a car zooming down the motorway to head back for the Clause 5 meeting to sign off the manifesto, and he rang me to say 2 national newspapers are running with a complete copy of our manifesto. There are only 3 people in the Labour Party who've received it: you, the leader, and me. Do you know how that might have happened? And like the blood drained. And I said, well, why would Jeremy leak his own manifesto, Andrew? And anyway, it turned out it was an earlier version of the manifesto that had been shown to our comrades in Scotland. So I felt slightly relieved. But I mean, for a minute, but in the end, the act of that manifesto, the explosion around the news story of the leak, allowed the sort of radical transformation elements of it to be widely disseminated. And in fact, the manifesto has gone into its 3rd reprint. It's the best-selling manifesto we've ever had, or in recent times. So that moment where you had a sort of manifesto that was transformational, contrasted to the Tory manifesto that was pernicious and arrogant, I think really set the terms of the election. And then sort of Theresa May was always on the back foot and basically running away from being held to account.
One of the arguments Andrew made, I thought really well when we were talking here a few weeks ago, was that success allows a sort of quiet page-turning exercise in terms of what went before compared to what went after the election results, in terms of the internal battlegrounds within the party, that sense of factional contest, the 170 MPs, no confidence motions, that was, not long ago. How much do you think that the sort of waters have covered over some of that recent history?
I think there's a lot going on there. I mean, there is no doubt about it. I mean, you can see it. The PLP is more united. I mean, there are still people who are very concerned about the direction Jeremy is taking the party, but I think people respect his right to do that now and have given him the space. And for me, he got 41% of the popular vote, the biggest vote we've had since 1997. He's entitled to make his play, and he's got the electoral authority to do that now. So the party is kind of coming together. But I think the other thing, which isn't, because these things are very subtle, aren't they? You're seeing a sort of greater degree of pragmatism in his own leadership. He's a much more relaxed in his leadership now. And I'll just point to a few things on that. When you think that he stood as leader when he was persuaded to do so by his friends who wanted to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Our conference this year did not have a discussion on the independent deterrent. Now, that's not to say that he's not very committed to peace and working through international institutions to rid the world of nuclear weapons. But the Labour Party policy on that is settled. And I think that's quite interesting because it shows sort of a degree of learning from other sort of radical experiences across Europe. If you look at Syriza in Greece, where they essentially offered massive economic transformation to their country, but reached an accommodation with the military, who have a history of occasionally deposing governments in Greece. But they reached an accommodation there. And I know you've had Paul Mason speak. I mean, Paul Mason described himself as a neo-Bevanite. There's a sort of, you can see a sort of new emerging sort of consensus in the Labour Party that says, yes, we unite around austerity. And when you think about it in 2015, the whole party really united around that position that we would challenge austerity economics. The disagreements were around foreign policy and defence. And I think you're seeing a greater pragmatism in that area from Jeremy as a leader, which I think will be important if there is another election, because we've still got to convince some doubters that Labour will keep people safe, secure and prosperous.
So you think there's some sort of convergence around the manifesto and the post-election debates in the party? I mean, it's true that the manifesto was sort of supported by left and right within the party?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one lesson we had actually is we should shorten the manifesto process. I mean, it's an explosively creative process to write a manifesto in 10 days, but it does not take a lot of the misery of committee room, backroom deals and moving sentences out and putting sentences in. And, you know, we've done this, I mean, we've been doing it for 30 years. In the end, you just had a very exciting, aspirational, forward-leaning document. I mean, obviously people challenged some of the sort of notions within it, but it was an exciting document and people were really interested in it. You know, thankfully, it was favourably contrasted to the Conservative document, which, when it goes through the government machine, always comes out slightly terse and, you know, lacking any energy. You know, because of the surprise win, you know, you see people at meetings sort of pulling the document out and quoting from it and debating it and discussing it. So it's become a living document within the party about how you go out and implement those sort of aspirational features of it. And I think I mean, you know, these things always have a shelf life, but I think there's a bit more life in it yet. And that in itself has been quite uniting, I think. I think it's brought people around.
I take all the unity arguments and the catharsis afforded by the election successes, etc. But below, there is something still in play, though. There is a tension at work in terms of strategy, the sense of... And that pivots around the class composition of Labour's vote, doesn't it, really?
Yeah.
And the spatial distribution of it. We had the highest two-party vote since the early 70s. 2 years before, we had the widest distribution of the vote across the parties, partly coming after Brexit.
Yeah.
But at the heart, there is still a tension around what happened in the East Midlands, parts of the wider sort of landscape compared to Canterbury or whatever. And that people like Paul Mason have argued that we should double down on the urban, educated, networked youth as the new base of the left.
Yeah.
And that is a fundamental redrawing of the base, the direction, the character of the left that is still unresolved, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it is unresolved. And every time I go and get my latte coffee in Kennington and I see Paul walking his Labradoodle, I always think, you should try and do that in West Bromwich, Paul, where working people are desperate for a Labour government and an economic realignment that benefits them. And we need to address their interests and their concerns. And that requires us to listen to what they fear. And, you know, that we are getting... but we're getting closer to it, because what they fear is more insecurity, more wage stagnation, more failing public services. And I think the next election, we can address the concerns of liberal latte drinkers in the cities and offer a transformational economics that gives greater opportunity to those working communities that have been failing very badly under the latter years of Labour in government and the last 7 years of Tory austerity. And if we don't build that coalition, we're not going to find that extra reach into the seats we need to win. Now, the tension about the remedy, I mean, there has always been a tension at the heart of the Labour Party, the three traditions of sort of, you know, your Christian socialist ethics, sort of values-driven politics that the early years of the Blair sort of leadership sort of typified. And then your sort of classic social democratic reformers or your command economy socialists. We've always found an accommodation. And I found it hard to see where that accommodation could come from in the first year of Jeremy's leadership. Partly because it wasn't in the hearts and minds of the people that could find a coalition to actually go and work it. I think the space afforded by the election result allows us to actually really work through those things. And there is much more goodwill amongst the sort of leaders of those traditions, or the people who are sort of advocates of those traditions, I think, in the PLP and in the wider movement, to come and work together to sort those thorny intractables out.
And it's sort of linked into some of the wider work you're doing in terms of both your culture portfolio, but also this commission you set up, which I think reports Monday.
Monday, yeah.
Which is on the future of work, which is a sort of live debate which underscores a lot of this question about class and the future left coalition. Partly the end of work thesis that people like Paul Mason have embraced, which assumes that the working class itself is on the wrong side of history. You know, the future belongs to a different form of progressive politics. And, technology is on its side, and
Yeah.
embrace of universal income.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about
Yeah, well, I mean, I came at this as a former digital minister where, I mean, in the sort of early days of that brief, I suppose you could describe me as a tech utopian. And then I kept reading increasingly dystopian pieces of research that said, there was one that said 50% of global manufacturing jobs currently done by humans will be done by robots in 2025, which I thought, is a pretty big challenge for a future government to take a look at. So we set the commission up, and we've got some. I mean, you're on it, John, but we've got some pretty heavy firepower. And actually, of course, we've taken a more sort of we're going to conclude more optimistically.
in terms of the end of work?
In terms of the end of work, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things we've got to do to make sure people have got the right skills for the new world of work, and there's some potential remedies in the report. But this idea that the robots are going to produce everything, the wealth created by the robots will be great enough for us to live our lives without the need for work or with a limited amount of work, I think it's pretty simplistic. And the report looks at the nature of good work and how that is fulfilling in itself for us as citizens, as humans. And I think it's really important that we start to focus down on that now. What is good work? How are they not just economically rewarded, but how are they sort of materially, spiritually, psychologically rewarded through work? You see, the difficulty is, what we know is, much of the jobs that are done now are going to be utterly transformed by these new technologies, AI and machine learning. And so we need to equip the next generation of workers with greater resilience, and that requires some pretty big policy surgery from a government of the future that understands that the state has to will some pretty big things. So I happen to, collaborative working in the early years of education, an emphasis on emotional intelligence, not just sort of all the other bits you're tested on in school, the ability to be flexible. How do you structure lifelong learning when, whole industries could be transformed by AI in 5 years? These are pretty big challenges, all of them requiring some kind of state-style entrepreneurialism that is not typified recent governments. And I hope the report that you're part of will sort of be a contributor to that future debate. And I hope we're going to get, I hope we can challenge the government a bit from opposition as well.
Because there was reports this week that the Taylor report legislation that would roll out of Matthew Taylor's report on the gig economy has been put on the back burner because the right-wingers in the Conservative Party won't tolerate forms of labour market intervention that he was suggesting, which puts paid to a lot of the rhetoric we heard from Theresa May when she got the job in terms of protecting people in the face of globalisation and the like. That creates a space there for Labour.
Well, it certainly creates a space for a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour, which is, we're not going to treat people like this anymore. It's just not right. And all these, there's another one, all these little sort of moves where corporations shift the risk to very vulnerable workers with no power. That's got to stop. People in restaurants having to pay for bills that haven't been paid because students in Oxford have run away and not paid for their pizza. That's just unacceptable. And, Jeremy Corbyn is very good at articulating those fears of an increasing group of vulnerable workers. And the one thing that came out of the budget, the fact that there would be 20 years of wage stagnation, and they just sort of casually put that in the figures without recognising that that is simply politically unacceptable, and it will never ever happen, because no government will be elected with 20 years of wage stagnation. There has to be a fundamental change, and I can't see how Theresa May. I mean, she lost those kind of blue-collar... She sacked all the blue-collar Tory advocates that she surrounded herself with. I mean, they were onto something with that. And they were certainly... I mean, the energy in her initial leadership was actually because she was prepared to challenge those orthodoxies and prejudices in her own party, I think. But the tragedy for her is she didn't have the strength or wherewithal to face them down and carry it through.
Well, it's the collateral damage of Brexit.
It's the collateral damage of Brexit and calling an election without a plan. And, but the people who are losing out are the people who work in restaurants and the gig economy, because even Theresa May could have sorted it with the right sort of series of decisions.
Just on the question of universal basic income within your review, I don't want to get ahead of your launch on Monday, but that is seen as a signature policy for, obviously it's embraced by all sorts of political agendas, but one agenda is the end of work thesis. So the UBI is seen as a logical state initiative to compensate for the consequences of epochal technological change and the decline in the material well-being afforded by traditional work, actually. What you're suggesting is, and John McDonnell is investigating the UBI.
Yeah.
Is it something you touched on in your...
Well, it's funny because I'm a different bit of the territory. I've been reading a lot about Jenny Lee, because in my other job I'm the Shadow Culture Secretary. And of course Jenny Lee was the first arts minister and was the first sort of minister to try and coordinate the arts from a government portfolio. And the theory behind that in the Wilson government was that automation was going to reduce the workers' working hours considerably, and we would need to offer them opportunities to do things with their recreation time. Well, capitalism didn't quite allow that to happen over the next 40 years. But the debate has now been started because of the rapid technological change that is disrupting every sphere. And the starting point does lend itself to an argument to look at UBI, I think. But when you test it, it doesn't really stack up. It doesn't really stack up with the numbers, in my view. It doesn't really stack up
in terms of achieving what it wants to do.
Yeah,
do you mean?
yeah. I mean, how do you? What should the basic level of income be to allow people to have fulfilling lives?
And how much it costs.
Yeah, but it's a little bit more than that as well, isn't it? It's about what is it right? What do we really want citizens to be? I do think there's an argument to say, do we want citizens to be dependent on this big state income expenditure apparatus? But have a look, wait till the report comes out on Monday. Of course, you know what's in the report, John, so this is like a strange conversation.
But it's a very interesting thing, the UBI, because it sort of refracts all sort of different traditions and public philosophies in and around the left through a big signature policy.
Well, and
so
the right as well.
Illuminating
yeah, the right and left can.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All this
across the broader right and left as well, actually.
Yeah, and green theory as well. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work. So, but have a look at the document.
But just to complete this session, then we can open up for a wider conversation. Your suggestion, I think, is that you're seeing an evolution of the Corbyn Labour Party, partly because of the electoral successes, partly because of the success of the manifesto. If you exclude the nuclear renewal question and international policy, there's a coalescing around a domestic policy agenda, which looks pretty resilient for the immediate future. That's sort of what I'm pulling out from what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's a lot to build on, which is of a piece of what Andrew was saying a couple of weeks ago, actually.
Yeah, there is a lot to build on, and Andrew has actually been very adroitly one of the architects of that, against all expectations, actually, for him individually. And, I guess being the deputy leader of a political party is pretty hard, particularly when 80% of your colleagues have no confidence in the leader, which was not a great day at the office. But I very much see it as my responsibility and duty now to try and bring those different groups together to find a consensus that can take us into the next election whenever it happens. And, I guess I do represent a slightly different tradition to Jeremy. I come from, the trade union world where class politics was still exercised, and I come from a town, not a city. And so I think I can offer a perspective on those people that we need to still convince to come back to us at the next election and help be part of that new consensus we're trying to build. It's not easy. There's a lot of jagged edges to this, and there are still, we're still getting through a very, very bruising time in our own history. But I just think the voters gave us the opportunity to start again. And so far, so good. Everyone is doing it with goodwill. And that's leading to this kind of cauldron of ideas. You can see all over the party people sort of pamphleteering again, people sort of evangelising, debates and discussions being had, more outreach, more listening, and people being interested in what we've got to say now. So I hope that I mean, that's not all the answers, but I can see us going into an election where we're more united than we have been since the sort of Miliband Brown years, where we've got a cogent plan. You might not agree with it, but there'll be a cogency to it, and there's unity around it. And contrast that to the Tories. That's not a bad offer.
But just one final point, just given what you said. I mean, I hear a lot of talk about the convergence and the increasing resilience of an understanding around the policy agenda. I mean, one criticism might be it's at the expense of questions of electoral or constitutional reform. It's quite economistic. It's quite sort of shrunken. It ignores debates around a wider sort of political alliance across parties or future electoral changes or the deeper constitutional questions that will confront any incoming Labour government. Is there a bit that's fallen off the edge here that allows for a convergence across left and right around some of these economic places?
Well, I certainly think that there's a lot more work to be done on the devolution agenda. The notion that you take power away from unelected bureaucrats in Brussels and give them to unelected bureaucrats in Whitehall should not be one that we allow to go by through default. And we now have a number of Labour mayors with relatively different powers. I hope that we can galvanise their experiences to get into the next election where we're talking about driving power out of Westminster and into some form of regional devolution that is meaningful. Because it seems to me that when you've got Scotland and Wales with maturing devolution settlements, the only way the English regions are going to compete economically is to take control of their own destiny. And they should be making the infrastructure decisions. They should be making the investment in skills decisions. They should be drawing in inward investment in their own way rather than relying on Whitehall.
I mean, a slightly wider conversation I was implying, which is, give example, before the election, and indeed during the course of the early skirmishes in the election campaign itself, there's a lot of talk about a progressive alliance, for example.
Yeah.
And indeed, there were conversations about, actually it was revolving around the Isle of Wight, and if Labour had withdrawn a candidacy in the Isle of Wight, there could have been a broader understanding about strategic withdrawals elsewhere, and if one seat had been changed, that could have cracked open. Might come from slightly different sides of this conversation, but that seems to have been a conversation that's disappeared off the political radar. As well.
I know you're implying it. I was just trying not to answer it. Yeah, well, look, I mean, again, this is just the classic, can Labour be a national party and stand for national change if it doesn't stand in every seat? And, the Isle of Wight thing, I mean, we actually discussed it. I wasn't particularly that bothered either way, but it became a great point of principle, as these things always do near to an election, and so it didn't happen. And in the end, it's good it didn't happen, because actually, I think that would have sort of unleashed forces that may have worked against us. I don't see much progress in that department for that discussion with the current leadership team there is in the party. I think Jeremy thinks that actually what we should be is a radical transformational green-leaning party, and those kind of minor parties that could benefit from those arrangements should actually vote Labour and change Labour from within. And of course you've seen many thousands of former Green Party members come to Labour, many thousands of former Lib Dems come to Labour. So I'm not sure where, I mean, I know Clive Lewis and others have pushed this very, very hard. I don't see that kind of cultural change germinating further over the next period. But it's a debate that's not going to go away.
I should give you 1 minute of opportunity to say about your portfolio as well, in terms of shadow culture. I know the Murdoch stuff, is that still on your desk?
Yeah, Murdoch stuff. Well, Murdoch is
but also
sort of
gambling and some of the wider social issues.
Yeah.
Before we open it.
Well, the Murdoch stuff is still ongoing. In fact, I noticed his house burnt down on the west coast of America in the fires yesterday, and I mean, I'm not particularly not laughing at that, but I did think, I wonder whether the lawyers will claim that the files were in the home when the civil cases come next month about phone hacking at the Sun, because they are not out of the clear in the rampant criminality that went on in the Murdoch empire, and indeed I've just had to give a witness statement for a court case next January. So. Yeah, but the real thing for the brief is, I mean, what we really need to address is the fact that there are too few voices in the plurality of voices from people who own our national newspapers. Now, I know they're in decline. I know the rapid disruption of the internet might make this argument slightly redundant in years to come, but I still think it's important that we look at ownership and where power resides in this country in our media, and we're doing a lot of work on that. And we, there might be more things in the manifesto once we've gone through our policy making process. And then on the gambling stuff, I was appalled when I started drilling down into the brief about 6 months ago to realise that the yield from British gambling has gone up from 8 billion. The yield is the amount the bookies take off punters, from 8 billion a year to 13 billion a year. And if you look at the demographics of where that gambling is coming from, it is low-paid working class people or unemployed working class people. And they haven't had a wage rise for the last 7 years. So they're taking more money off people who can't afford to lose. And when you think that the Gambling Commission say there could be up to 430,000 people in this country who are addicted to gambling, it seems to me we've got a national epidemic that is, on a scale with alcohol abuse or other forms of self-harm. And as a state, we've not recognised it. So, and indeed the government don't know how many people they're treating for gambling addiction, what the impact of acquisitive crime is from people who are feeding their addiction. And so we've just set up our own review to try and map that out, so that we can come back with some solutions if we're in government. I think it's a deep area of neglected policy that we need to get right for the next general election. So thanks for letting me get that in, John.
Right. That's been a sort of random tour around the bases, really. The idea is to crack it open, Please. Now, everyone has to hold this, or else you don't get read into the record, I don't think. So I'm going to pass this around as we go. So, gentleman there, and gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Rowan, doing a deep dive in politics here. Just two questions, one really quick. The UBI report, did they look at UBS, Universal Basic Services?
I don't think we did we?
No, we didn't.
And I think maybe that is actually a better solution.
Yeah.
And then it leads me to my second question, which is, this is a talk about the future of the left, but I think you missed out the most important thing for the future of everybody, and which is the environmental crisis.
Yeah.
And I think I want to understand the thinking within the Labour Party of what I think is the greatest contradiction of society potentially today, which is growth destroying the environment, but at the same time people feeling more and more economically insecure. And I'd love you to mention something about that.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Noah, doing a postdoc on attitudes to Brexit at the moment. And a recent YouGov poll found that 40% of Labour supporters don't know what the Labour Party's policy on Brexit is. So what is the Labour Party's policy on Brexit?
Oh dear.
You just take a third one.
Robert Taylor,
Fantastic.
you come from the trade union tradition and the labour movement, but you haven't anything to say about the future of the unions.
Yeah.
What role will the unions play in this new world of work? Or are they now become completely irrelevant? And linked to that, you were there, I remember you, in the early 80s, when the rank and file mobilising committee were wrecking the Labour Party and the militant tendency were momentum. The Times in particular is always digging up stories about momentum.
Yeah.
The hard left.
Yeah.
Are they the hard left, or are they the post-trade union left?
Well, Robert, it is fantastic to see you again. When I was a young political officer at the AWU, it was always a delight to try and convince you that we were in the right, and sometimes you agreed with us. Well, no, firstly, to just set it in context, it seems to me that the greatest tragedy of the New Labour years was that the trade union movement didn't take the opportunity offered to it by the TUC under John Monks to completely radically reform itself. And he offered a sort of reform that made British trade unionism look more like German unions. 3 big unions, general, industrial and public, and shopfront, TUC, you join and then you're allocated a division. And so greater clarity, greater coherence in organisation, more policy support for trade union members. And it's kind of left the trade union movement a little bit sort of out of position, I think. And I think there's work that could be done on that. Now, there is that resurgence of sort of hard left factionalism that is a distraction to anyone on progressive left politics, that sometimes sort of spills over into sort of nihilism, but occasionally actually affects change as well. And with momentum, it's a slightly contradictory beast, and one that I have a very complicated relationship with, because there is no doubt that some of those hard left factions that we remember from the 1980s, the Trotskyist revolutionary organisations, use the vehicle of momentum to try and do what they do in political parties. But actually, momentum themselves, the leadership of momentum, drove them out with brutal autocratic discipline that the Labour Party itself was once renowned for. But when I meet people who identify with momentum, what they tend to be are very idealistic young people, pretty well educated, who are very angry that their share of the economic settlement in this country is not going to their generation. And actually I find them inspiring. So there is a contradiction in this organisation that is still working itself through. And the way they feed into Labour democracy is actually patchy throughout the country. So you can go to some areas and they're trying to drive out all the councillors and deselect the MP and not be outward focused. But you go to other areas and they've completely rejuvenated our parties. So if you go to the southwest of England, the Labour membership in the southwest of England has gone up 400% in the last 2 years. And it is people who have come through momentum who have rejuvenated these kind of shires. So I know I always get reported as condemning momentum, but actually the situation is more nuanced. The relationship between momentum and the big trade unions is also interesting, because they are filling a bit of a gap that the trade union policy departments or organising departments used to fulfil within our party. And actually I see an emerging tension, I won't say it's any more than that, a sort of creative tension between some of the big unions now and the agenda that's been set by momentum that might actually create some challenges for us as a leadership team a few years down the line. But I'm only it's early days on that front. What is Labour's policy on Brexit? You know the lines that I'm going to trot out to you, so I'm not going to do that. What you're really saying is, why aren't you taking a harder line on Remain? Well, that's what most people sit behind that question. And you also know why we're not taking a harder line on Remain, because we've got to respect the decision of the referendum. Now, that's not to say that our position can change as these negotiations go down the line. And for me, you see, there was before we went into the election, one of the discussions we had was, do we say to people, we respect the decision of the referendum, we will negotiate removal from the EU in good faith, but we will put that position to the British people in a referendum at the end. And if they think that our negotiation position our negotiated settlement is not good enough, and they vote it down, we will resign. Which means you're respecting a manifesto, you're negotiating good faith, but the people have a choice. Now, that notion was sadly rejected, probably for very reasonable reasons. But it does seem to me that the position we're in, where we've set out our negotiating principles, it's very difficult to do more than that when you're not actually round the table doing the deals. But we are keeping all options open. And, I'm sorry that 40% of the nation tell YouGov that they don't know our position on Brexit. But if 40% of the nation know what the government's position on Brexit is now, I'd be very, very surprised. If 40% of the government know what their position is on Brexit, I'd be surprised. And then on the green agenda, look, if you want to sort of... I think you should have John McDonnell talking about sustainable growth, right? If you want to talk about the economics of it. All I can say is that when we talk about environmental protections at the moment, our current discussion is about how can we protect those international treaties and those institutions that protect the environment, and how can Britain take a leading role in that? Because it seems to me that this kind of, sort of post-Brexit isolationism, the biggest threat actually is when it comes to our global commitment to climate change and environmental protection. And so a lot of our policy making is based around that, not on a sort of radical model that can reduce consumption. But there's obviously, the debate goes on in the party, and if you'd like to help us with some of that, come and talk to us.
Student here, and John and I had an exchange at an event like this last year, talking about Jeremy Corbyn and moral leadership that people respected, moral clarity. But word that you've used now several times in this conversation has been pragmatism.
Yeah.
Pragmatic Jeremy Corbyn. Can you perhaps walk us through what the trade-offs of those things might be? Do you think that it's possible that he may lose some of that edge in bringing more of the PLP around? And what you think that means for his brand of authentic leadership?
Okay, that's a good question.
I'm also a politics PhD student here, politics from Northern Ireland, so I won't be asking that right now. But it's great to be back in the news. So my question is, talking about the future of the left, what we've seen over the past years, ever since the 1980s with Thatcher, but also to an extent under Tony Blair, and then with the crippling impact of austerity, the slow erosion over about 30 years of most of Labour's achievements from the golden era of social democracy in Britain, to the extent even Royal Mail is now privatised. The only one that appears left it being the NHS. And I'm sort of wondering about, given that no party stays in power forever, however much we might wish it, well, we don't really wish it was so, but anyway, how is Labour thinking about building not only new institutions, but also institutions that will last, will prove as durable as, say, the NHS?
Okay.
Could you just pass it round to
Hi, Ian McLean, Fellow of the College, also fascinated by Northern Ireland, but I'm also not going to ask about it. I am going to ask about Scotland, because pretty likely scenario that the election, whenever it happens, yields Labour as largest party but without a majority, and the largest potential coalition partner would be SNP, and I think it's probable that after the next election they'll be larger than the Lib Dems. Minority government or coalition, and what will Labour's policy be re Fastlane?
Okay. Internal contradictions of Jeremy Corbyn. Version 311. Don't over-egg it. Don't let me over-egg it on the pragmatism. Leadership forces you into compromise, whether you like it or not. And actually, it's nothing to do with the PLP. I mean, the PLP are pretty unified around Jeremy now. He's faced them down and he's won. The pragmatism I talk about is the pragmatism between him and predominantly working class communities that need Labour governments but need reassuring that their economic interests are best served by his leadership and that the security of their nation is maintained. And I'm not over egging it, but I do think there are, you can see a greater strategic, pragmatic leadership from him as a person than you would have seen 2 years ago. But you would imagine that, wouldn't you? When you've had nearly half a century on the outside, radical campaigner pushing the system to change, to all of a sudden have your hands on the sort of apparatus. Once you start working the machinery a bit and you know your way around, you know how to get outcomes, and that requires consensus building, compromise, priority setting, bit of strategic planning, working out where you handle thorny issues tactically, and he's become more adroit at that. And from my point of view, I suppose that I've always been more pragmatic in my politics. I'm deeply reassured by it, in both personally and in my kind of role as deputy leader. And that's not going to take away his quirky idealism and his sort of authenticity and his character. And he's still going to give me advice on what all-weather anoraks I should wear when I go biking in the winter, which Gordon Brown and Tony Blair never did when I worked for them. So I think you're just seeing him emerging as a stronger, more strategic, focused leader.
Just on that, Tom, with hindsight then, given all you said this evening, And given the 10-point jump in the Labour vote at the election, etc., would you say he was the best candidate in 2015, given the way he's sort of pushed back against what's happened to mainstream social democratic parties across Western market economies in that period?
It's difficult to. Well, I mean, look, I can't conceive of anyone who could have done that in an election. You always learn these things in hindsight, don't you?
But
I mean, the political context at the time was utterly unique, so yeah, I mean, I guess I would. I really would. You know, he's made a lot of space, but by the way, the other thing is that, of course, the responsibility of being a potential prime minister becomes greater when you have won 41% of the popular vote and the government are hanging on a thread. And, you know, going to bed at night knowing there's a realistic chance of that actually does change your thinking. And it does for me, you know, the idea that, you know, I've got to work a bit harder and try and make sure we're more coherent. So I think that's what you're seeing with him. And then I should have written the question down. Well, I'm going to ask you a question, though, because I've been talking to my team on the train, and I tried to remember the last time that Irish policy brought a government down. Would you know that? When? 22.
Yeah, because the fall of Lloyd George was the Unionist revenge.
Yeah, okay.
1886 is another thing. We need to talk about this.
We'll talk about it afterwards, yeah. What were you asking me about again?
Durability. How do you build durability?
Okay. Well, so the great thing, I mean, obviously you look back at our history. When you want to bring about radical and lasting change, you need to build new and enduring institutions. So, you know, Labour did it. Obviously, the NHS is the one that we always discuss, but you could say the Open University, which gave access to a new generation of access to higher education to a new generation of workers, was transformational. Or I would argue that the Low Pay Commission in the 97 government, which John was part of the sort of development of, was an institution that actually changed millions of people's lives. So there are whole new institutions I think we need to build to protect the next generation of workers and citizens, you know, and I think that Labour's view of the state willing things is actually sort of will help us with that. So we definitely need a new institution to look at data ethics, which is, you know, one of the potential things that could not only screw our economy but undermines citizens' rights and protections. But you've got to have that view that the state, you know, the state, it's only the state that can create these things. And if you've got a sort of philosophical view that you're just creating these institutions just get in the way and stop people finding clarity through market forces, then you're obviously in difficulty. So now we're going to, obviously, our manifesto suggested creating a lot more state institutions as we bring some of those private entities into public ownership again, but that's not the whole answer. But you know, Labour historically has been very, very good at bringing about huge social change by creating very deep institutions. And if you've got any, you know, if there was a point you were trying to make about a specific one, let me know at the end. And then, I'm sorry, I should have written other questions down, but I got Faslane. Okay, Scotland. Well, firstly, on the politics of Scotland, I'm much more optimistic about Labour's chances of winning back seats at the next election in Scotland. We were surprised by how many we won this time, but actually we shouldn't have been. And again, when I was campaigning in the local elections in Scotland before the general election, where the SNP were saying they were going to take every seat in Glasgow, and they didn't do that. I mean, I think they won control, but and the conversations I was having on the doorstep were very different to the ones I was having in the general election when we got wiped out. People were talking about public services again. about education and health provision. And 10 years in office, in government in Scotland for the SNP, people were beginning to go back to domestic issues, and obviously the independence debate is still vital, but I think the SNP are tarnished by their failure in delivery, and the radicalism of our manifesto inspired more people. So I think we can actually realign further in Scotland. In fact, today this week from a tiny base, we've just passed the Tories again in the polls. I think we're on 28% of the polls. So I think the offer of the manifesto, the repositioning of Labour in opposition in Scotland in the Parliament, gives us great opportunity to win back more seats in Scotland. On coalition, there won't be a coalition. Consistently, Jeremy has said we are not going to do deals with any political party, so that obviously lends itself to an argument that if we don't win a majority, we'd try and run it as a minority government. And then on Fastlane, I honestly don't know the answer. If we're in power, then we would retain the independent deterrent, and I don't see it changing unless there's a massive clash between Westminster and Holyrood. But I can't give you chapter and verse on that, but only because I haven't the knowledge. I don't know.
Anthony Barnett from Open Democracy. First, I just want to thank you very much for your rather unpragmatic standing up to Rupert Murdoch over the years, which has been very admirable, and you should be thanked and congratulated for that, and may it continue.
Thank you.
But what I would like to ask you, I want to go back to the question of Brexit, because it does seem to me that you said in the coming election that if it comes rapidly, Labour's offer is going to have to be on the table, and that the election, if it takes place in the next year, is going to be about Brexit will be quite central. And if there is an election in that time period, it's inconceivable that the Tories would agree to go into the election with Theresa May as their leader, given that she is absolutely clearly an election loser. So any such election means you're going to be facing a Michael Gove or somebody who will have a coherent position of the principle of Brexit. And so the question I'd like to ask really is a bit like the one that I asked Andy 2 weeks ago, and isn't there a kind of a night's move for Labour in terms of combining a growing democratic agenda on the economy with its European policies? And to try and spell it out just a bit more and push you on this, because it also seems to me that Labour does have a relatively, although you're keeping all options open, as you put it, you're clearly in favour, I'm very pleased about this obviously myself, of staying within the regulatory space of the European Union for jobs, for security, for culture, for change, etc. Whether it's a specific form of the customs union or whatever it might be. But of course, in political terms, that means there's not much point in Brexit. If you're staying within the regulatory framework and you're okay about the European Court. So what is your answer in that sense to taking back control? Where is the democratic? Don't you need to have a clearer, more principled cry which meets that demand, but which also has sort of condensed onto Brexit, and you need to be able to respond to your European policy. It can't just be a matter of jobs, especially if you're up against a coherent, relatively Brexiteering conservative who's trying to sort of do a Falklands on you. You've got to come back on that area, and isn't there a danger of trying to put that off? That you can't produce a rabbit like that out of the hat in 10 days.
Just take a couple.
Okay, yeah.
I'm Danny Dorling, I'm a geographer. To give you an idea where I'm coming from, I read an article a couple of years ago for the Labour list, which very annoyingly they titled Corbyn's Moral Clarity Will Propel him to number 10. I'm now less annoyed about that, that they did it. But that's where I'm from. It's a geography question. At the very beginning you talked about the country losing its soft power. And I can see how this will be, and losing judges, we lost one over in The Hague as well. I can see how this will be played out as, you know, a patriotic thing, saying we're going down, it's terrible that this government is going taking us down. And that's one thing for how you play it. But where would you rather actually be in the future? Haven't we been playing above our strengths? Wouldn't it be better to be a normal European country where people have better health, live longer, trade unions are stronger? And can we possibly actually ever articulate that, or we're going to have to pretend all the way through this election campaign that we really want to be top dog again, and that's the most important thing? I'm asking the question because I don't know the answer to this question.
Where's your accent from?
It's from here, well, originally Oxford.
Oh, right, okay, so it's a bit Midlandy.
Very quickly, sorry, I'm Ben Ansell, politics professor here. Just assuming that Theresa May doesn't go on for another decade of supremacy, and you face another Tory leader at the next election, who would you least like to face?
Okay. These are
3 questions.
okay.
Sorry.
So look, on the you see, I can't give you clarity on the question you asked me, because I don't know where the course of our internal discussions will end up. You are absolutely right that the power deficit, or the democratic deficit as a result of the settlement, is one that I think is live. But I don't know. I mean, what will be our single sentence mantra on the deal, which we've not even reached a point on that yet. So I'm sorry if I'm not giving you clarity. I don't know whether Andrew was better at answering this question, but internally there is still a very big discussion within the Labour Party about where we want to end up, and it would be counterproductive and not helpful for me to sort of reflect the different strands of that argument that are around the shadow cabinet table. But you know that there are differing viewpoints about where we should be on our offer. So I think we're very clear about the principles of the current negotiations. I very strongly believe that a general election would allow all the political parties to take clearer positions on where we find ourselves as a country in the middle of these negotiations if there is a general election. And I think it is our duty to be very clear about where we think the national interest lies in a manifesto. I think we would need a mandate. But I literally cannot tell you what the outcomes of those discussions would be. And I wouldn't be able to tell you whether, where a Clause 5 meeting would end up in the debate. And this is more important in the Labour Party than it has been in recent elections, because we do have these discussions and there are votes. These are not sort of pre-prepared policy offers. So I know the point you're making, and I know where you're trying to tease me, and I'm personally very sympathetic to where you're trying to take me, but I simply cannot give you the answer to the question you ask. And maybe that's showing that maybe that's proving the point from the colleague at the back, saying that there's a lack of clarity. I think it's more that there is still quite a lively discussion. Now, that's not to say I think that there will be further repositioning of our policy. I think you could probably expect us to say that to be very clearer about where we think the customs union, where we sit on the customs union, and that could well become an argument to say that it is the preferable outcome rather than a possible outcome. I know these things are nuanced. But as the negotiations go, as the government negotiate, it allows us to clarify our position when these issues have been taken on. So I know I've only partially answered that, but I can't offer you any more. You look disappointed. I'm very sorry.
I'm thinking hard now.
Yeah, okay. And then I'm terrible tonight. What would you?
It's about
you?
I'm placed in the world.
Oh yeah. You basically want us to become Norway with that argument. Is that what you said?
All the Netherlands,
All
all Germany.
Netherlands. Yeah. Okay.
the final break from empire and a reimagining of
Yeah, I've got it.
Not Russia, not Turkey. All those countries that used to have empires.
Yeah, well, except that, okay, so internet diplomacy can often be portrayed as sort of, post-imperialist grandeur. But when you're the seventh richest nation on planet Earth, you have responsibilities. Whatever, okay, I think we have responsibilities, and that means we need to be internationalist in our outlook. We have to work through international institutions. You may agree that we've made a hash of it, but in international peacekeeping and conflict resolution, we have a role to play. We have very great institutions that can deal with these things, and I think they are worth honouring, revering and protecting. Now, that's not to say that I want more Netherlands-style cycle lanes in our cities and towns, that I want greater trade unionism, that I want a kinder, gentler politics, that I hate all the pomp and grandeur that we have in our sort of institutions. But I think Britain's role in the world is worth protecting. And actually the depressing thing is we are basically a laughingstock. We need to do something about that. And then who would I least like to lead the Tories into the election? Well, for me, I think they will end up with Boris Johnson. Yeah. Because I think ultimately they'll take a gamble on him, and I don't think he'll do that good a job. I think the more dangerous route for us would be a radically reforming, next generation Tory leader. Someone like that Tom Tugendhat, who strikes me as being a thoroughly decent individual, doesn't carry any baggage of the Cameron years and could be defined in whatever way they see fit. But I'm not sure if they've got the wherewithal to skip a generation.
Gentlemen, am I missing anyone who wants to say anything?
Peter, studying PPE here. I was wanting to go back to the Progressive Alliance. Do you think there was a Brexit effect, that there was a kind of indirect Progressive Alliance, or are we seeing a long-term shift back to two-party politics? And also, perhaps, with respect to the proportional representation.
Okay, yeah. I think for the first time in many elections, voters had a really clear choice. They were very, very different manifestos, and that really was significant, more significant than we really knew at the time. And that brought a lot of people who consider themselves on the sort of progressive left or in radical politics or turned off by mainstream politics. That brought many of them back to Labour. And you could probably argue that the people who rejected our manifesto or were fearful of a Labour administration left fringe parties on the right like UKIP and went back to the Tories. I don't know whether it's the return of two-party politics, but there was certainly choice. And then on the Progressive Alliance, okay, and when I answer this, I normally say the Labour Party is a Progressive Alliance. Now, with an audience like this, I know that's slightly glib, but I guess we're trying to be a Progressive Alliance, and we are trying to welcome people from different political traditions into our rather sort of rusty structures. So, you know, young Greens, young ex-Lib Dems, you know, so the internal debates are changing. You know, we've had a lot more discussion on the role of civil liberties. You know, I find myself talking more to audiences about the legal challenge I made to the government on their data retention and investigatory powers grab than I previously did, which is very rewarding for me personally, because it makes me sort of realise we've got some new thought leadership coming through the ranks. On proportional representation, Jeremy's against it. I don't see an appetite in the party to go down that road again. I'm personally agnostic about it. I'm not that worried. But I don't think you'll see that discussion sort of made as vigorously as it has been in recent years in this next bit of the Parliament, although I'm usually wrong on these matters, so who knows.
Can I just ask one final question, Tom, given what you have to say? I'm taken with your thoughts that things could move quite quickly and the possibilities of another fairly imminent election, given how you could game out the next few months. Given that the likely manifesto will have renationalisation of 4 major chunks of the British economy, abolition of student fees, free education, confrontation with austerity, dealing with the Brexit negotiations and consequential effect of it all. Are you having time to invest serious amounts of time across the shadow cabinet in preparing for government? I mean, this is going to be a tough, rough ride, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes a lot to get a law passed in Parliament, let alone the scale of the ambition that's been shown. How much energy is being invested in the preparing for government agenda? Yeah, interestingly, there is quite a lot going on behind the scenes on that front. I mean, I'm 50 years old, and I feel like a gnarled up veteran when I look at the shadow cabinet now. I guess that comes to you when you hit 50, but there are very few of us left that have held ministerial office in the shadow cabinet, and that's obviously a challenge in itself. So we've got ex-civil servants and ex-ministers in to help brief our shadow cabinet colleagues on machinery of government, you know, looking at how different administrations have run the Downing Street operation. We've got the veterans of the Prime Minister's strategy unit and delivery unit. We're looking at interrelationships between the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's team. We are taking our shadow teams away to get them to sort of percolate their policy priorities out and start engaging ex-civil servants on how you might get a department to initiate your objectives. So we're doing a lot, and we're probably doing as much as the Blair leadership team did in preparation between 94 and 97. We had some insight into that, the two of us, and that sort of scaled up the nearer we came to the election. But of course, this is one. But the trouble is when you're in parliamentary cycles, if you've got the uncertainty in the system where there could be an election at any moment, you are duty bound to focus your energies back into that bit of the territory. So it is tricky to get the balance. But we've got John Trickett, our Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, is coordinating it. And he's got Lord Kerslake in, who's sort of working through what machinery of government might look like. So I hope we're in better shape if there is an early election. And the good news is the civil service have also been exposed to our manifesto for longer. So there will, I'm hoping they'll be thinking about where we might sequence and prioritise some of those commitments. Great. We're done. Bang on time. Thanks for coming down. I thought it was very wide-ranging, and hopefully we can express our appreciation in the customary manner.